Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Devin Parfait. I'm a current senior at Williams College who's majoring in geoscience. And throughout my time at Williams, I focused on environmental issues and my passion for people by researching how coastal land loss is disproportionately affecting tribal communities in Southern Louisiana, while also mentoring Native youth, doing advocacy work, and collaborating with my chief and other tribal communities on various projects. When I turn 25 this year, I'll become part of the next generation of Indigenous leaders by assuming the role of chief of my tribe, the Grand Cayudilac Band of Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw. And if you'd like some more information, we'll put some links down in the chat and you can click on those and research a little bit more and explore. But without further ado, thank you for choosing to be a part of Claiming Williams Day. The theme for Claiming Williams 2022 is Breaking Cycles. Where do we go from here? The goal of this year's Claiming Williams is to look inward and question how we can break cycles of oppression, injustice, and the notion of effortless perfection that defines experiences at Williams College and beyond. Before we begin, we respectfully acknowledge that Williams College stands on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship after being forced from their valued homelands, they continued as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Thank you. A few reminders before we get started. If you have any questions during our talk, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen at any time. We'll have dedicated time for Q&A toward the end of the program, but you can submit your questions as you think of them. Please reserve the chat as a space to engage with the community and share any reflections or comments that you may have. And remember to select everyone in the chat drop-down box so that your message can be seen by all. Please note that we'll be recording this session, so we ask that you refrain from any personal recording, which can and include, but is not limited to, taking screenshots, copying and pasting, or any other forms of reproduction. And finally, we welcome your feedback on this and all Claiming Williams events. Please note that we will drop a link to a short Google form at the end of the session where you can add your thoughts. And with that, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, Chris Stearns, Williams class of 1986. Elected in 2019, Chris Stearns is the first Native American Navajo to be elected to the Auburn City Council in the city's history. He has spent his career in private practice and government advancing the rights of Native American tribes. Prior to serving in elected office, Chris spent 30 years working as an attorney, government leader, and public policy advocate fighting for justice and human rights. Chris is also currently of counsel to Hobbs Strauss Steed & Walker, a national law firm specializing in representing Native American tribes across the United States. Chris's practice involves gaming, sports betting, public policy, and energy. Chris previously served as chairman of the Washington State Gambling Commission, one of the oldest and most respected gaming commissions in the country. And in 2018, he received the Legacy of Commitment Award from the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling. He was also named one of the 25 people to watch in 2018 by Global Gaming Magazine. While working in Washington, D.C., Chris was appointed by President Bill Clinton as the first ever Director of Indian Affairs for the U.S. Department of Energy, where he helped Secretary Bill Richardson create a national Indian energy portfolio. Prior to that, Chris served as Democratic counsel for the Committee on Natural Resources in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he oversaw national legislation on Native American issues such as tribal self-determination, healthcare, and gambling. He also served as deputy counsel to the House Subcommittee on Native American Affairs. His community service includes 2 terms as chairman of the Seattle Human Rights Commission during the years the city of Seattle was going through police reform, as well as serving as president of the board of directors of the Seattle Indian Health Board for the past 5 years. Chris received his Bachelor of Arts with honors in history from Williams College and his law degree from Cornell Law School. So thank you so much, Chris, for making the time and building space to be with the Williams community today. So I'll give it to you, Chris.
Wow, thank you so much, Devin. What an honor to be introduced by you. I'm just so grateful and really proud of all the work that you're doing, and just really looking forward to seeing all the change and growth that you're going to bring to your tribe. So that's a remarkable future ahead of you. And I just also wanted to thank Williams, for inviting me here. I'm really proud to be associated with the college. And I also want to thank the chair of the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Indians, Shannon Halsey. She spoke earlier today, and she's just an outstanding leader on not just for her tribe, but on the national level as well. So I believe I've got a slideshow coming up that'll just sort of talk. I wanted to just give you more a sense of, who I am. And so, look, there's a picture of me. That's a great, I love turquoise. I'm supposed to be wearing turquoise right now. That's something that Navajo people, we believe in. So we can go to the next slide. So I think to understand me and for, what really shaped me, you have to start here. This is a map of the Navajo Nation. And the 4 states are Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. And we used to have a lot bigger territory in Colorado. And that's where 2 of our sacred 4 mountains still are in Colorado. But there's a little circle by a town called Pruitt on the bottom right-hand corner. And that's where my mom was from, Lucille. And Lucille Curley was a very young, she was a teenager. And so this is sort of how my life started. I'm a product of federal Indian policy. And right after World War II, the government, the United States, decided that it really would be worth making a concerted effort to end the reservation system. So the goal was put forth in 2 big policies. One was called termination, and there the government just actually simply terminated Indian tribes right out of existence, ended the federal trust relationship that tribes had entered into by virtue of signing treaties. And the other program was called assimilation and relocation. And so in the late 50s, the government, the United States, hired a gentleman named Dylan Meyer. And Mr. Meyer was famous because he was in charge of the relocation and internment program during World War II of the Japanese in America. So that was who took over our program at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And anyway, the idea was to relocate as many Native Americans away from the reservation and into big cities. Those cities were originally Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Dallas, and Denver, but they grew to encompass a lot of other cities, including Cleveland and Seattle and Minneapolis and Boston. So my mom, living down there in Pruitt, she got enticed into hopping on a bus to Los Angeles. So next slide, please. Here's a poster that was going around in the early 60s, saying if you're Native, you move to the city. There's just a better life for you. Most of pretty much everything there listed wasn't true, but it sounded good. And my mom being a 16-year-old, it sounded pretty awesome to her. Next slide, please. There are a bunch of Native women arriving in Los Angeles in the 50s. So that was probably about 6 years or 5 years before my mom arrived in Los Angeles. And so my mom moved to Los Angeles, and she had a daughter and my half sister, and she couldn't really take care of her daughter, so she sent her back home, back to the Navajo Nation reservation. And so in a sense, the policy of relocation, or you can see the cracks in my family's history. But the next year, I was born. Next slide, please. And that's where I was born. I was at the good old North Hollywood Presbyterian back then. And unlike my sister, my mom decided that she would put me up for adoption. So that's where I ended up spending the first almost 2.5 years of my life in the Los Angeles County foster care system. And that, that's sort of the other side of the other face of the federal Indian relocation policy. Next slide, please. As it turned out, I was able to escape escape the foster care system, and I was placed with this wonderful family in New Jersey. And there's a picture of me. I think that's like a llama, or I don't know what it is. To us Navajos, everything looks like a goat or a sheep. So I think in my DNA, that's what I was looking at. Next slide, please. And so we can just stop there for a second. So that's where I grew up. I grew up most of my life in southern New Jersey, just outside Philadelphia. And I'll just share one anecdote. So when you're growing up and you're a kid, and you're doing something, exciting, fun / stupid, like jumping off a cliff or, building a ramp and riding your bike over it, you yell something. And back then we all, yelled Geronimo. And I think, the concept of watching this young Navajo kid, going off a ramp yelling Geronimo, that's pretty much the definition of assimilation right there. I think that is something that'll always affect me. But I was fortunate enough to end up going to Williams, and I really did enjoy it there. I started off pre-med, but eventually found out that I was much better at history and political science and other things than I was science. So, but I still didn't know what I was going to do when I graduated. And I ended up going to law school because that seemed like something to, help further whatever it was I was going to do. And it was during law school in the late 80s that, I really decided, okay, I think I have an idea of what I'm going to do. I think I'm going to go and, help Navajos, help other Native Americans. And then during law school, this gentleman, his name is Tim Jacobs. He was Lumbee from the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina. And he and a friend of his, they decided that no one had really listened to the tribe about all the crime and all the drug trafficking and everything else that was happening on the reservation, and the state police and the feds weren't doing anything about it. So they decided to stage a takeover of the local newspaper, and that didn't go over great. But they ended up fleeing, and Tim went up to the Onondaga reservation just south of Syracuse and just north of Cornell of Ithaca. And he left the reservation, was arrested, and this was during his extradition hearing just outside of Syracuse. And that really changed the trajectory of my life. I mean, and I remember going on a bus and up to Madison County, and we were all protesting, and people there weren't really thrilled to see a bunch of natives up in the area, but it really helped sort of form my sense of, wow, there are lawyers trying to help this guy, and he's fighting for a good cause. Next slide, please. So one of the things that also helped form my experience was after I graduated, I was all excited, and here I'm a brand new lawyer working in Washington, D.C. And I went back to my reservation, and I had done some work there during college. And friend and I, we decided, you know what, this is like probably 1991. We'll catch up. We'll go grab a dinner in Gallup, which is in New Mexico, just off the reservation, right on Highway 40 and Old Route 66. And so, I'm there in my nice rental car. Who knows what I'm wearing, but I'm sure I was dressed nicely. We go to what was then the old Holiday Inn, and totally denied service. And I'm like, wow, holy cow. This is like still happening in the early 90s. And, people really don't care what you're doing there or who you are. It just, really brought home that kind of experience that people in my tribe had experienced for decades, if not centuries. And so that just furthered my resolve to stick with Indian law and try to change the world through the law. Next slide, please. And I ended up working for this guy, Congressman Bill Richardson, who is just like a totally charismatic leader, and he became the chair of the subcommittee on Native Affairs in the House, and I really cut my teeth on Indian policy there, but I also learned a lot about politics from him, and is really dynamic person. And next slide, please. And after I worked for him, I went and moved to the full committee up from the subcommittee and worked for George Miller, who was a totally different kind of politician. George came from a Bay Area district that was incredibly liberal. George was elected in the Watergate class of '74 and never faced any kind of real serious competition for his seat. So as a result, he did not have to compromise really any of his principles or any of his values. And it was just so wonderful to work for someone who was truly committed to human rights, to workers' rights, to education, and Native American rights. And we always knew that we could push as hard as we could as staff on an issue, and he would support us. Next slide, please. I just threw this in here just because I remember having the chance to meet so many amazing people when I served in the House, and Congressman Lewis is just a personal hero of mine. Next slide, please. After I left government, I found myself out of work in early 2001 and looking for a job, but I wasn't short of things to do. And there we are protesting the inauguration in January of 2001. And you can tell I was going to move to Seattle because look at what's in my hand. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is sort of where I'm, what I'm doing now. This is a totem pole that was raised, almost a decade ago, but it was in honor of a gentleman, an Indigenous artist named John T. Williams. And he was shot and killed by the Seattle police in 2010. And there was something that was, just changed the entire city. There had been police shootings before, but this one was captured on camera. And it just totally changed how people viewed police in Seattle. And there was a large call for reform. And in fact, under President Obama, his Justice Department came in and started a full investigation of the police. But the Native community really came together. And John's brother, Rick, was also an artist. And Rick was a master carver. So this totem pole was carved by a number of natives, but all under the direction of Rick Williams. And that's the day the totem pole was raised. It's on the Seattle Center grounds next to the, then it was called the EMP Museum, and you can see the monorail there. Next slide, please. There's Rick. There I am. I think I was campaigning, but Rick is just a wonderful, wonderful man, and who, really, I just learned so much from him, because the guy has just such love in his heart, and to, watch him actually work with the police to try to bring change was really something. Next slide, please. And as I spent more and more time in Seattle, I got involved more and more in human rights and trying to protect human rights. Next slide, please. And that led to work in my firm, where we work on things like missing and murdered Indigenous women, and we work on protecting sacred sites. And this is a national honoring of by Native women, and that's Vice President Harris. Next slide, please. I pulled this. This is a close-up of my wife, and she's man, she gets out there and protests. I learned everything about protesting from her, and our daughters are also pretty amazing at that. Next slide, please. We got to work with a lot of Native leaders, and making Indigenous Peoples Day a reality in Seattle, as well as King County and the state of Washington. Next slide, please. I'll just do a little digression here. There is such a thriving Native community, Indigenous community in Washington State and Seattle. I love working in Washington, D.C., but it's nothing like working out here, where there's such a thriving Native culture. There's just a picture I took of all these canoes lined up on the beach during the annual tribal canoe journey. That's in West Seattle. Next slide, please. Here you can see the canoes coming to land. Just such a wonderful sight. Next slide, please. The canoes lined up in the water, waiting to be called in to land. This is a group of canoes from Alaska and British Columbia, and my wife's in one of them, and so is our youngest daughter. Next slide, please. And this is just up the street from us, up the road, about a mile and a half. Auburn is where I work and live now. We're right next door to the Muckleshoot Indian tribe, the Muckleshoot Reservation, and they host a number of powwows throughout the year, and you just can't beat it. Anyway, next slide, please. The Seattle Indian Health Board hosts an annual event called the Indigenous Peoples Festival, and always some pretty cool artists to see. Next slide, please. And I learned all about race and social justice, and standing up for people through my work and my family and our community. And this is an event we were at protesting the treatment, the separation of immigrants who were in the federal prison right outside of Seattle in SeaTac. Next slide, please. I don't know if I put that in there, but he's a great guy. And, I love working with anyone I can to, help advance the Native Indigenous rights. Next slide, please. My personal life, I'm always managing dogs. So if you hear one in the background, it's probably the one on the right. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. There we go. That's sort of how I started my new chapter in life. That's I think that's our victory party. That's our youngest daughter, who's a student at UW, which is University of Washington, which is, the school just really doesn't get it. I don't know why their colors are purple and gold and they have a big W, but clearly ours is better and first. Anyway, next slide, please. One of the issues I get to work on now is protecting our environment. We have two glacier-fed rivers that come from Mount Rainier that go right through our city. And the Green River, which is the northern one, goes up and dumps into the Elliott Bay in Seattle, which was a Superfund site. That's where Boeing used to be headquartered. That's where the war effort was really centered, and everything just got dumped into the Green River, which up there is known as the Duwamish River. And as a result, the salmon just really, well, they're an endangered species. And so we get to work now to really change that. And one of the issues is creating safe passage so salmon can get back to their original spawning grounds. This, we opened up a big culvert here in Auburn, so salmon could go through a big wide passage under the road instead of a little tiny corrugated tube, which they don't like to go through. And now, as soon as that happened, about a week later, you can see the salmon spawning in the creek. Next slide, please. We're all about human rights here in Auburn. I'm glad that my council members are too. Next slide, please. And then just lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the work I do now. Most of the work involves working with tribes across the United States, but we spend a lot of time, or I do, on working with tribes here in Washington. Washington has 29 tribes. All of them have gaming compacts. Most of them run casinos. Next slide, please. Gambling is a pretty big business, 3.3 billion. As you can see, most of the tribal component right now, actually the updated numbers are about $3 billion a year in revenue. Next slide, please. One of the big issues that I worked on, and now some of the tribes have joined on, is teenagers betting, and young adults and even medium-aged adults betting on games that are not gambling games, but you can still bet on them. The big one is Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which is run by Valve, which is a city based in Bellevue, a city here just outside of Washington. Next slide, please. And they bet on what they call skins. And you can see this is a couple of years old, but the skin on top is worth about a little bit over $4,000. It's just a graphic that attaches to a weapon that you have. And depending on how they're made or how they're designed and how rare they are, they could be worth a lot of money. Next slide, please. And like everything else in life, people figure out a way to bet on them. And so you can put your skins up for gambling. And here's a game of roulette based on all the people playing have put up their gambling skins for operation. Next slide, please. We can skip this one. Sorry. And I just wanted to go through a few other things we worked on. Is gambling, it just affects every area in life, but for people of my generation, there's no shortage of games, Pac-Man, Missile Command, and Galaga, that have not been converted to gambling machines. Next slide, please. I'm just so grateful for working in this area. I'd love working on Indian gaming. Next slide, please. And just love hosting stuff too. So next slide, please. And problem gambling is a really important issue. My own life and my personal life, I'm so grateful to be in long-term recovery, but it was really an honor to work for people in Washington on bringing exposure and solutions for people with gambling addiction, gambling disorder. Next slide, please. And we can skip that one. Next slide, please. And we can skip that. I'll just, I was going to go into a little bit on sports betting, but I think I've probably covered enough. So you could probably go through, we can go one more, and I'll just end on this. This is the big issue in Washington State, but it's nationwide and certainly in Canada and other nations too. And that's a crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women. And I'm glad that our firm works on this, and I'm also working on an Attorney General's task force here in Washington to, protect our women and children. Next slide, please. That's a march for MMIW in Seattle. Next slide, please. And there you go. That's the last one. Just grateful to be here to sort of offer up a little bit of what I do, and just to thank the college for everything that it has provided to me. So with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that wonderful presentation. My name is Anthony Purnell Mcgee. I'm the Associate Director and Director for Inclusive Career Exploration. The best part of my job is working with BIPOC students and first-gen students. And I'm going to be with Chris for the next 40 minutes, and we will discuss various issues. But I want to start with your time at Williams College. And this is more of a reflective piece of the program. What resources, people, communities did you wish you had access to while you were at Williams? And this could be in terms of your professional or your personal life.
Well, as a Native American and really just growing up on the East Coast, I was certainly a fish out of water. That whole Geronimo anecdote is sort of an example of it. But there weren't any other people that I really saw around me other than my own brother, who was younger than me, who were also Native American. And so I think at Williams it would have been, I would like to have seen other Native Americans. There's certainly an issue that I became a history major, which was, oh, thank God I did. Such a great major, and it was all the stuff I loved rather than all the science I was really bad at. But I chose to write a thesis my senior year, and it was going to be on my tribe. And I was able to go out back to my reservation and do some research. But as I was looking for an advisor to help me with the research and to write a thesis, I went to the history department, and there was no one there who, really felt like they could have, be my thesis advisor. And I ended up with a really wonderful visiting professor, Angela Williams, I believe, and she was an art history professor. So, I think that, and I loved working with her, but, I really wish, there had been an opportunity for, someone on the permanent faculty of Williams to be versed in and knowledgeable about Native American issues. I really would have loved that. But so that's one thing that I'm really looking forward to the college, really developing on, which is, recruiting more natives, having more Native faculty, and having more Native American curricula.
Okay. Thank you. What do institutions like Williams owe to current students and communities that have been historically marginalized and exploited by the elites, powerful institutions, or the government?
Wow, that's a really, really deep question. I think by virtue of the fact that most colleges and institutions have, first of all, they're on native land, and I was glad Devin read that acknowledgement. Nothing's free, and so just the land itself is so valuable, and the resources on the land that universities have been able to leverage. They really benefit the universities. There are other big schools that are going through a challenge now with the land grant programs, like Cornell, that actually got land from a federal act that belonged to Indian tribes, and it just increased their portfolios at a point in the late 1800s when they needed money. So, a lot of the institutions and colleges and universities have been able to become thriving, powerful institutions. But I think they forgot, or they don't recognize, the value of the land and the resources they sit on. So there is an obligation to, help all kinds of people, but certainly the first people whose lands they're on. And that's why I was just so happy to see the tribe just build this relationship with the Stockbridge Munsee tribe. It's just so heartwarming. Some of the things that I've seen other universities do, and the University of Washington, for instance, they're offering, the tuition there is pretty high, but they're offering in-state rates to any Native student whose tribe used to be in Washington or has a connection to a Washington tribe. So there are things that universities are starting to do right now to really help correct some of the injustices.
Okay. So besides having faculty on staff and some type of a scholarship program for Native Americans, is there anything else that you would like to share with us at Williams that we could definitely think about and implement in the future?
Well, I think the overall, I guess, desire or wish that I have is that the tribe would, the college, Williams College, would use its incredible power and influence. Looking back and seeing how Williams has affected my life, and just seeing all the people, I get to go on like Facebook or LinkedIn, and you can see all these conversations from all these people just here in the Seattle area, talking about, well, they saw a car with a license plate. It was really cool, and it was all Williams, and just all these people from here, in this area jumped on to talk about it, and you realize, man, Williams has such power, such prestige, such influence. I just love to see that, being used to help, people who are disadvantaged. I'm out literally banging the drum for Native Americans, but there are plenty of other people too, many other who've been displaced in our nation's history, and they could have someone in their corner who's freaking heavyweight like Williams.
I totally agree with you. So let's segue to the national legal issues that are facing Native Americans. But I think before we begin to discuss those issues, we need to discuss the relationship with the federal government and the sovereignty and the self-governance of the Native Americans, nations, and tribes. So what is the significance of the Marshall Court on ending law jurisprudence and the relationship between the federal and state governments?
Well, the Marshall, Justice John Marshall, early in the nation's history, in the early 1800s, he was the Chief Justice, and he wrote a series of Supreme Court decisions that laid out the foundation of what the rights are of Native Americans in the United States. Prior to the formation of the country, tribes were just considered separate nations, and they're referred to as existing outside of the U.S. in like the Articles of Confederation, or even the Declaration. Well, the Declaration is totally different because we're merciless savages, but going over that part, we're still someone that is dealt with through trade. And as the country grew in the early 1800s, and people wanted our land, there was a pressure to move us, and that's why a lot of tribes, like the Stockbridge Munsee tribe, they used to be here, now they're in Wisconsin. My high school is just starting to look at a similar relationship with the Delaware Nation, the Lenape, whose lands they sit on. But the Delaware Nation is in Oklahoma. Tribes were moved out west, and the land in Georgia was especially valuable, and the Cherokee Nation didn't really want to give it up. So there was a big case, a series of cases, and that made their way to the Supreme Court about whether or not tribes had the right to not just stay there, but what kind of powers they had. Were they truly still sovereign, separate nations, or were they somehow limited because of the overwhelming and growing power of the United States? And in those decisions, Justice Marshall wrote that tribes were sovereign, but limited sovereigns. They were domestic, as he called them, domestic dependent nations. So they had lost some of the rights. And the reason, which is, I think a lot of people, during the course of our nation's history sort of just took this as granted, but the reason now sounds a little bit more suspect. And it was because Marshall's decision was based not just on, say, the military might of the US, but it was also based on a doctrine that the Pope, the Catholic Church, had promoted in the 1500s, the doctrine of discovery. And that said, basically, if you're not, Catholic, you or some other form of Christian society, you don't necessarily have the right to your own land. And that So that actually the Cherokee Nation, they were kind of like, holy cow, what's going on? And they really made an effort to build like schools, housing, hospitals. They taught English. They were doing the whole assimilation thing in the early 1800s, so they could say, "Hey, we're totally down with the United States experiment," and then that still wasn't good enough. The tribe still, the Supreme Court ruled, had lost the right to govern as fully sovereign nations. So that's sort of where Indian law starts. What are the rights of tribes today? And those rights over the next 2 centuries really were reduced in scope to the point where Congress has the power now to break any treaty at any time. And tribes no longer have full control of what happens within the reservation boundaries. But all that stems from the Marshall Trilogy in the early 1800s.
Okay. So based on the Marshall Trilogy in those series of cases, what is the impact of the national government policies on Native Indian and tribes?
Well, the history of federal relations has been, it hasn't been great for us. There was certainly a lot of removal. That's what was happening in the early 1800s. There were wars, and some of those happened before the formation of the United States. Tribes were at war with the Spanish in the Southwest, or England up in Canada and the northern US. But the wars were the next chapter in the United States, and those happened in the mid 19th century. My tribe, we fought the US in the 1850s, and about half of us were eventually rounded up and marched 300 miles away to a prison camp for 3 years until we finally relented and agreed to sign a treaty in 1868 that took away all of our reservation in all of our lands in Colorado, including 2 of our sacred mountains. So what we got out of it was promises. Tribes all received promises when they signed the treaties. They were signing them as a government to another government. And so we gave up land, and in exchange for the land, the government promised, okay, we'll provide healthcare, we'll provide schools and education, we'll provide food, we'll provide law enforcement, basically. And so all those things were conditioned on the land. And so from a tribal perspective, we're like, anytime you guys want to give us the land back, you can have your schools or education. But this is like a deal that lasts forever. And so it was really shocking for us to learn that Congress could actually abrogate those treaties. And then, as I mentioned earlier, even terminate tribes as it did in the 1950s and 1960s. So the treaties, the land, that's still like number one for Native nations, but also bringing back, restoring, solidifying that government to government relationship. And that's really important, because I think it's pretty natural for people to think of Native Americans as a race. And yeah, race is sort of a construct. And certainly when we fill out the census every 10 years, we check the Native American box as a race. But as the Marshall decision mentioned, and then as Congress and the Supreme Court has routinely clarified, tribes are still governments. So when the United States has an agreement with a tribe, it's as a government, not as a race. So that, that what that translates a lot into has been that, programs for housing or schools or education, they're not a racially defined relationship or a contract. That's a contract between a government to another government. So that way, those programs that are run just for Native Americans do not violate the equal protection or discrimination clauses in the Constitution or the state constitutions.
I mean, land is so important. It's more than just an economic asset. How is the federal government complicit with allowing corporations to extract energy and resources from indigenous land without first obtaining free, prior, or informed consent?
Yeah, well, I mean, the land issue was always that was like problem number one. And you know, early on, the government really just turned a blind eye as you know, individuals or corporations or you know, local governments decided we need this land. One of the first things I worked on when I joined the staff on the subcommittee with Bill Richardson was restoring a tribe that had been terminated up in Michigan. And as I was writing the history of the tribe, I was just, holy cow, I can't believe what happened. I mean, the town, like, I mean, literally went out and burned their village, burned it to the ground. And the sheriff went out and was leading that, you know, because they wanted the land. And you know what, the tribe said, we're not going to move. It was most of the other tribes in the area did. They went down to Kansas and Oklahoma, but that tribe stayed. So, you know, the federal government's role in that, they wanted nothing to do with it. You know, they just totally turned a blind eye to it. So land that was, you know, taken without being protected by the government, that was one thing. I mean, there was land certainly acquired by the government, by the federal government, and then the states through wars. I mean, our whole Colorado portion of our reservation, that's Colorado's now. But you know, whether it's the Black Hills in South Dakota, you know, well, most of the United States, right? That's been taken over. So we lost not just, you know, the wealth that comes with the land, but we lost a lot of our way of life. And you know, one thing about being Navajo is that our spiritual relationship, our connection to our Creator, and our the spiritual beings who inhabit the world, there's a strong the connection is strong when I'm on the land itself. I mean, there are ceremonies that need to be performed on our homelands. And I mean, there are other religions where you can be totally spiritual no matter where you are in the world. But for us, we have to be on our lands. And so when those lands were taken, you know, there was some spiritual damage done too. So those are some of the really big effects of that. And then, of course, out west, you know, you have a lot of issues regarding water and the rivers that were, you know, whether we lost the rights to the water. I mean, all the tribes in southern Arizona and southern California, you know, the Colorado River like disappeared because the water is going to LA or going over to Phoenix. Up here in the Northwest, boom, all the dams just appeared, and now the salmon can't get over the big dams, and that affects the orcas. It's really something. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay. You briefly touched upon the Native American adoption process for assimilation, and there were two phases of this. The first phase where children were taken from their families and put in abusive boarding schools that began in the late 1800s, and then phase two was the Indian Adoption Project policy. What is the systemic impact of these two policies on Native Americans?
Well, it's been nothing short of devastating. I mean, there have been really concerted efforts to, you know, not just move us off to reservations, to sort of move us out of sight, or to assimilate us. But you know, the Indian adoption programs that popped up, you know, at the same time as the other programs that were hard pressed that occurred in the 1950s and 1960s. You know, we're still reeling from that. There were so many tens and tens of thousands of Native children who were put up for adoption because you had social workers from the government or from big churches, going to the reservations and basically, you had a checklist on your clipboard. Oh, wait, they don't have electricity. Ooh, that's bad. There's no, running water. Oh, that's terrible. Oh, they have to walk 15 miles or 5 miles, whatever, to get to school. That's bad. You know what? That's good enough reason to terminate their parental rights and separate the children. So the problem got so bad that Congress finally did step in the 1970s. And so in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, and it was designed to totally stop that. And in fact, the bill itself says that Indian children are the greatest cultural resource that Indian tribes have, and those are being taken away from them. So the problem was the theft of our culture. And that was, that wasn't the first time. And as you mentioned, Indigenous boarding schools had been in existence since the mid 1800s. And the same issue, just taking children, for more or less the same issues and putting them in boarding schools. And at some point, I think there are over 100 of them around the country. And the same thing was going on in Canada. And there you were punished for even speaking your language. Your hair was cut off. And kids who ran away, they didn't always, they didn't get back home. I mean, there are programs going on right now to reinter children who are buried. There are graveyards at some of these schools where kids died. And now some of the schools or the states that inherited the property from them are working with tribes to rebury those children back in their homelands.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I usually like to have a call of action. So this is the last question. How do we honor and respect our Native Indigenous communities? What can be done here at Williams and nationally?
I think as a Native person, the challenge has always been to just be understood. There's some of us who we want to be loved by everyone. That's not reality. But to be understood and growing up as a child in the late 60s and the 70s, I consumed as much TV and radio and films as I could. And man, I mean, I as someone who's being assimilated in New Jersey, I learned a lot just by watching TV. And I mean, the image you got of Native Americans was just, man, it was terrible. We were either like, criminals on the loose, and then John Wayne and whatnot had to come and save the white people, or we were, just these super amazing environmentalists and talk to animals. And neither one of those are real. They're fantasies, but they're harmful. And then don't even get me started on the whole sports team thing. I mean, I am grateful that they're the Commanders now rather than the Redskins. But those things really distort people's view of who we are. They prevent them from seeing us as real people. We've got the same issues, and I can certainly say that in my work for tribes, one measure of tribal success has been they've been able to reclaim and take back running their own programs. Tribes like the Stockbridge Munsee or our neighbors here in Auburn, they run their own housing. They have their own transit. They run their own schools, and they run their own healthcare. So, I mean, and they do an amazing thing. Our youngest daughter, she goes up to the Muckleshoot tribe for equine therapy. That just is like not something you really come across except in like really, expensive parts of Seattle or Bellevue. But you know what? The tribe is doing it here. It's pretty amazing. But with that, we have the same problems. There's issues over money, and but we're just like everyone else. And all we're all that a lot of Native people are looking for is to be understood, to be treated, we're friends, we're friends with everyone. And Lord, we want to share our culture. I want everyone to go and eat like sheep. I don't know if everyone's ready for that, but it's the best thing in the world. Powwows, we want people to, come to them and just see our culture and care about the same things we care about. We care about the land, and we do care about animals on the land. I mean, we've been here for 50,000 years, and there wasn't a huge problem, until the last couple hundred years. So, just understanding a little bit more, and so learning about tribes. I mean, no matter where you are, you're standing on someone's land right now, and so learn about that. And go check out all the cool new Native American museums. Go buy stuff online. That's, buy stuff from Indigenous artists. Don't buy them from knockoff, companies that just appropriate art. You can actually support living, thriving Indigenous people, artists, and companies, rather than supporting a non-Indian company.
Well, Chris, it has been an honor and a pleasure to sit here with you for the last 40 minutes and having these great discussions. I'm going to turn it over for Q&A, and Leah is going to conduct this part of the program. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you so much, Chris. This has been so interesting. And actually the number of questions that we have in the queue, I think really speaks to people's interest in what you have to share. So thank you. Chris, I know you were speaking to the Indian Child Welfare Act. We have a number of questions about the current legal battle involving the ICWA and preference for placement of children with Native families. Could you just speak to that a little bit?
Sure. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 set up a system. And it's not perfect, but what it does is it tries to sort of build out a concentric set of circles of how an Indian child might be placed. So for instance, when I was born in Los Angeles, the thing was, unless my mom told my tribe, they had no idea where I was being born. So that's an important component, that once a tribe has to know. But once the tribe knows, that kind of stops everything, or should stop everything. And at that point, the tribe is now automatically involved as a party in the termination or establishment of parental rights in family court, no matter where it is. And then the court then is supposed to, under the law, try to place the Indian child first with someone in that child's extended family. And if there's no one that they can find within that family, option number 2 is to place a child with a family in the tribe. And then if that doesn't work, option number 3 is to place a child with another Indigenous family, anywhere in the United States. And then option number 4, if you ever get to that, is, place the child wherever they can. But courts have really, in a number of states, bent over backwards to limit the application of the law. So they're really limiting, well, when does a tribe find out? And number 2, what if the parent, doesn't want the child placed with another Native American family? So where the parental rights start and stop, and then what is what's the definition of an Indian family? So those are the questions that 40 some years later. My math is terrible, as I said. I'm terrible in science, but that extends to counting. But since '78, those problems have come up. Now the Supreme Court in the early '90s really reaffirmed the status of the Indian Child Welfare Act, but the court has changed directions, and so they're going to hear a case that could really limit the scope of the placement of Native American children with Native American families. So we're just waiting to see what happens. But as I said earlier, there is that loss of culture, that loss of connection. And I was placed with a non-Indian family, and they were just wonderful. But, you know, I feel like I won the lottery on that. And not everyone's going to have my experience.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. There are a couple of questions in the queue about tribal utilization of gaming revenues and what that relationship is. Can you address that a little bit, Chris?
Yeah. So tribal gaming is first and foremost, it's government gaming. It is the same thing that you would find if you live in a state where there's a state-run lottery. You know, it is not a casino that's owned by, you know, like Steve Wynn or, you know, the former president. You know, it's not, you know, the profits don't go to an individual, a family, or even a corporation. With governmental gaming, the profits go to, you know, everyone. And in fact, that it started as Native Americans in Florida and Southern California built up high stakes bingo operations in the late 70s and early 80s. And the federal courts of appeals in Florida and California both ruled that, you know what, their tribes are doing their own thing on their own reservation. And if a state does not regulate, if a state does not prohibit that activity, but instead if it regulates it, then the state has no authority whatsoever on the reservation and on regarding the bingo halls. And that freaked all the states out. So they you know, amazing speed. They went to Congress, and Congress with amazing speed, you know, like a year later passed a law that to limit that decision. And that's how we got the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988. And there Congress said, okay, tribes can do sort of traditional games like stick games or games of chance that tribes have done for, you know, tens of thousands of years. The states have no business in that, neither do the feds. If it's going to be a game that's like bingo, then states also have no business in that, but the feds will regulate that through a newly created National Indian Gaming Commission. And if everything else, but basically casino style games, sports betting, all of that, we're going to create a brand new system. And so tribes can do it as long as they have an agreement with the state called a compact. And that was brand new. So that's sort of where Indian gaming has been since the late 80s, and tribes compact with the states. And once you have a compact, then you can, you know, then the tribe can operate basically, you know, casino gaming. All the revenues are spelled out in the law of 1988. They have to go for the benefit of tribal membership. So, you know, whether it's the money is being put into mental health, behavioral health, schools, roads, all those things, governmental services, that's where the money goes.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's really informative. In the same vein of sort of thematic topics, could you speak to cultural appropriation in the legal sphere? So whether that's like a trademark infringement, property rights, intellectual rights, having to do with Native culture and how that's appearing maybe in current case law?
That's actually like a little bit outside my area of expertise, but there are intellectual property rights that tribes have successfully, you know, asserted in court. The Cherokee Nation finally got Jeep to change the name or share some of the profits. My tribe, we went after not only Mazda, there used to be a Mazda Navajo, but also like Urban Outfitters, which had Navajo themed underwear. You know, what on earth is going on? We don't know, but you know, there is intellectual property that the tribe has to its name. And that wasn't recognized until more recently, but now it is, and tribes are, you know, they're asserting those rights. But as for appropriation, really think of a company here in the Northwest called 8th Generation. And 8th Generation, it was started by an indigenous artist named Louis Gong. He started actually with a pair of white canvas tennis shoes, and that he painted with traditional designs on them. And it just, that idea took off. But then he had a bigger idea, which was, why do we as indigenous people, we do these honoring ceremonies, and in many of them, we will place a blanket over someone's shoulders and wrap them in it. And Pendleton has been the blanket of choice for as long as people can remember. And Louis like, why do we not make our own blankets? And that became his next mission, was to put Pendleton out of business. And so if you go to the 8th Generation store or online, you can now buy these beautiful woolen blankets designed by Native artists who get a chunk of the money. And so the logo of the company is inspired natives, not native inspired. And that to me is just such a really important model for tackling appropriation. Yeah, I mean it's one thing, I think, to go to court and help our culture and help our children by saying, you know what, you shouldn't be using our likeness or image or making a mockery of it like some of the sports teams do. But it's another thing to actually start bringing money in to our community. And that's sort of the future. You're seeing more and more indigenous owned companies. And now 8th Generation has like a huge operation. They now produce their own. I was at their store, their warehouse the other day, and just seeing these giant machines that weave rugs is really something. So I'm really hopeful for that and really taking a bite out of appropriation.
And a really good reminder, I think, to all of us tuning in, that as consumers, our dollars count, and we're voting, for certain things with our dollars and supporting certain things with our dollars. So that's great, Chris.
Yeah, I just saw, I'm trying not, every time I look at the chat, I'm like going that way and it looks weird, but I just saw someone put something up about the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. And yeah, now it's a federal crime to sell artifacts when you're pretending or asserting that you're indigenous when you're not. And yeah, that happens all over the place. I mean, to be honest with you, I mentioned turquoise earlier. Most of the native indigenous turquoise in Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah has all been mined out. The mines are gone. So you're just not going to go find turquoise. It's hard to find it, but it exists all over the world. But what you routinely have are people selling turquoise from Asia, marketing it as, well, that's authentic, native turquoise. It's not. People will pretend to be native artists. And now people are getting arrested. The feds are doing a really good job of busting up distributors who, basically import a lot of fake native jewelry from China. Those are being stopped. And people who've been making money hand over fist for decades are actually now going to jail. So that's really good development to see.
That is a good development, and actually it sort of blends into the next question. I want to give a shout out to Rebecca Salazar, class of 89, who shares that she's beginning law school in the fall. An area of specialty will be intellectual property, and is really interested in this. She's asking you, how did your experiences, clinics, courses in law school help and inspire you to pursue Indigenous rights?
Wow. I'd love to say that they did, but they didn't. I just happened to go to school at a time when there wasn't Indian law. I mean, we had Indian law students. There were about 3 of us per class. I went to a school, Cornell, which is pretty small class-wise, about 175 of us in each class. So, but the university, there's a huge Native presence. So it was kind of, that was great, but it was not in law school that there was a very big Native presence. We didn't have Indian law. That was not a course. I found out about it because I had a cousin who worked in a legal program called Pine Tree Legal Services up in Maine, and they did work for the Passamaquoddy Nation up there, and so that's sort of how I really became knowledgeable about, well, here's another thing you can do. I honestly thought I was going to go work in a big firm and then, maybe go back and meet all, friends of mine from college back in New York. And I was lucky because I went to work in a big firm in Philadelphia my first summer, and I hated it. And, I remember telling my parents, I'm like, I think I need to find something else, and maybe I should look up these Indian law firms. And my parents are both like horrified because I already shot down the whole idea of becoming a doctor. And I was like, okay, that was strike one. And this was like even worse. Every year I'm going to work for a firm where you wouldn't get paid very much. But I was inspired by, as I mentioned, by the going to the trial of Tim Jacobs. And I was inspired by, just learning what my cousin did. And there were options. And in fact, there was a gentleman in my law school class a year ahead of me who ended up working for an Indian law firm, and he was a mentor to me. So that's sort of how I got it. As the years roll by, Indian law is taught all over the United States, but back then it wasn't. And in fact, I think that's one of the questions I eventually came to ponder was, I chose Cornell because it had a great name, but it didn't have Indian law. In retrospect, I could have applied to, say, the University of Colorado Boulder or UCLA or University of New Mexico or Arizona, all of them which back then had native law programs, and the professors back then are now like legends. And I realized, what, I probably could have gone to one of those schools and really learned from firsthand from some of the legends, but I didn't do that. But I the circles are small, so we, still got to interact with them. But I'm really glad that students now, you can take great Indian law programs at Cornell or at Harvard or, still at University of New Mexico.
Thank you so much. Chris, there's a really great kind of reflection from Peter Green, who's sharing. They happened to be in Canada this past fall. The country was celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, a national holiday, very powerful on radio and TV. There are stories of Indigenous peoples' experiences. Are you aware of any attempt or thought to plan such, that sort of national recognition happening in the United States as a nationwide conversation?
Yeah, I mean, there have been attempts in the past. I believe, God, I think it was President Bush too, that proclaimed the day after Thanksgiving as National Native American Day. But nothing's really sort of taken root at the federal level, but at the state and local government level, it totally has. Out west, it's a little bit easier. You see it happening more just because there are more Native tribes around, and they're pressuring, like City of Seattle. We did that in 2013. Seattle declared Indigenous Peoples Day. And the key was to getting the council not just to declare it a day, but to actually provide funding, because we all want a parade, and you got to close down the city streets and pay people. You have to pay people to not go to work. So getting the money behind it, getting the institution of government behind it is really important. That's happening at the city and county level, and there are some states that are recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day, which is now not the day after Thanksgiving, although that's actually the state holiday here in Washington. But we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day in October. The first Monday in October is what most cities are doing. So it's becoming a big thing. Up in Canada, everyone wears orange to mark the day. And usually there are some big issues that sort of become wrapped up in it. And in Canada, it's certainly the boarding school experience, making reparations to Native children and their families who were taken. And that's moved forward in Canada. People wear orange shirts for that. People wear orange or red shirts for missing and murdered Indigenous women. In the United States, our new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who's from Pueblo in New Mexico, she just created a boarding school reconciliation project. So, I think there's going to be more of a national movement, hopefully regardless of who's, in control of the White House or Congress. So I have hope for that.
There's a great follow-up question to what you're just speaking about from Dennis O'Shea, asking about Secretary Haaland and how you assess her immediate priorities and long-term goals in this first year.
But she's just absolutely amazing. I think that she brings in like a lived experience as as someone who's been a single mom on a reservation, but someone who understands and practices her culture. She's lived through those examples. And there's also another Congresswoman, Sharice Davids from Kansas, who's Native American Ho-Chunk, and those two have really changed, I think, the dynamic in Washington D.C. But Secretary Haaland, has the power of the White House behind her, and so whether it's trying to solidify the relationship with tribes, whether it's looking after issues of the legacy of boarding school, and she's also created a missing and murdered Indigenous women's project too with the Justice Department. So she's had a really big effect right off the bat.
Thank you so much, Chris. We are rounding the bend here in terms of our time together. There's a great question here that's asking you, so as a Native American alum, Chris, do you feel invigorated by ongoing developments at the college? I know you spoke a little bit about that earlier, specifically the partnership with Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation, as well as student research on Stockbridge-Munsee past, present, and future.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally invigorated. I could go out and run a lap around their block. It's amazing. And I think when I see that, I wonder, why isn't everyone doing this? And I do get to bring it up. I mean, with Cornell, it's a little bit different because they're surrounded by tribes and they've had that relationship. But with my high school, I asked it the other day with our president, and he was like, that's a great idea. We should do it. So I think what the college is doing right now is inspiring. I mean, I can't not say it's overdue, but it is totally the right thing to do. And, it has to mean something, though. I mean, that I think is the output, if that's the right word. But there should be, Stockbridge, Munsee, whether it's a fellowship, whether it's scholarship, whether it's a mini alumni society, whether it's a building, or something where, the tribe can come back and exercise some kind of control like they did. I mean, they used to farm the land. They used to perform ceremonies on that land. And maybe, they need space to do that again, because that's what they had been doing for tens of thousands of years until the late 1700s. But, it can all start again. And that's what I'd like to see.
think that's a great note to end on, Chris, in terms of a future charge, a current charge for the school, being action oriented and thinking about how we grapple with our own reparations and what that means here at the college. I just want to thank you so much, and I want to recognize Chris, who is currently a member of our executive committee of the Society of Alumni, and Chris is really thoughtfully pushing us to talk very openly and consider so many of these current issues, and we're just really grateful to Chris for being that voice. So thank you, Chris. We will have a post-event email with many resources that Chris has very kindly coalesced and shared. And we do hope that you will engage in more Claiming Williams sessions throughout the day. There's a really great session also coordinated by Alumni Relations. I'll give a quick plug. It's called Reshaping Boxes, Understanding Needs and Intersectionality in Identity-Based Groups. That's coming up at 3:45, but there are a lot of sessions, as well as an evening keynote with Craig Stephen Wilder at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you have a moment, please do complete the Claiming Williams feedback form. It's really useful to those of us on the steering committee so we can help inform programming moving forward. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much to Anthony for his representation from the 68 Center for Career Exploration, and to Devin for being a part of this as well. We hope you all take good care, and thank you again, Chris, for everything.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate everything you're doing. And I'm glad to see everyone who watched this, and I can see everything in the chat, and I'm just so grateful for all of that. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.